Okay, well, the first thing I'm going to say is a big thank you, first of all, to our audience and also to our esteemed guest today, who I'm very, very honored to welcome to the Simply Inspired podcast. And today's guest is Sensei Morris Doshin Sullivan. Now, hopefully, I'm saying that the right way, also known as Takio Phap Hang Nat. Now,
Yeah, don't worry about all of that stuff.
but the Dharma name, though,
Yeah.
which I'm going to ask you about that because that's very interesting. But anyway, known by those different names, which I've probably murdered. But today we are making the spiritual path, the Buddhist path, the Dharma teachings accessible to more people and accessible to you, the listeners, in your two ways. First of all, by sharing some of the Buddhist wisdom itself that Sensei or Morris has learned over his many years as a practitioner, having been a Dharma teacher since 2004 and a Zen monk as well, first ordained, I believe, in the Thai tradition, and now a minister with Bright Dawn, which we'll find out more about after. He will have his own definitions for the way that he teaches and what that really means. I will say that this is a man who makes a positive impact with a lot of people, or to a lot of people, I should say. It will be interesting today because the concept of a Buddhist practitioner at Sensei Morris's level, speaking about self, is a little bit ironic, I must say, but nonetheless, we will be speaking a little bit about his personal journey as well to where he is today, in the hope that you learn and gain a few pieces of applicable wisdom from this. I will also say please subscribe to the Simply Inspired channel, and also by the time that you have finished this, I'm sure you'll want to know more about Sensei Mark's work. We will give that a mention later on as to where you can contact him. But for now, I will bow best I can in this space, and it is lovely to be sharing this moment with you. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's good to be here with you.
Likewise. Good feeling, and I've been looking forward to this. As I mentioned, I came across some of your work on LinkedIn, some of your posts, had a little look into what you do. Very, very inspiring. Now, as I've already mentioned, you've been teaching for a lot of years, you've been involved in Buddhism for a lot of years, and I would like to touch on the beginnings. As I mentioned before, we will share wisdom itself, as in separate from your life and some applicable things. But I think people getting a feel for yourself personally, your journey, and so forth that has led you to this path will be very interesting and very relevant and meaningful to a lot of people. So, would you mind sharing where this all began and where you first?
Yeah. I'm not sure when I first encountered Buddhism. I was a teenager, and I had grown up Baptist, in the Christian church, and in the late '60s realized that the church that I went to and I were on opposite sides of some things that I thought were kind of important, like civil rights and war, and that sort of thing. And so I started trying to expand my horizons, and I read about other religions, and Buddhism just clicked with me. And so I was probably, I don't know, 14 years old when this happened. In college, I studied uh, philosophy and religion, social sciences generally, and so I read a lot about other religions, and again, Buddhism just kind of always resonated. My first formal practice with a group was in the late 1980s. I was going to a Unitarian Universalist church, and the pastor at this church had attended retreats with Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, and so she started a group sort of based around his teachings, and we read his books and sat the way he said to sit. And so that was probably 88, 89, somewhere in there. I was what we considered a nightstand Buddhist mostly, people whose Buddhism lives on the on the shelf next to their bed for a large part. I meditated and that sort of thing, but I wasn't a part of a community because where I was, there weren't a lot of communities. But I did read a lot and try to practice as best I could. In the early 2000s, about 2002 or so, I'd moved to DeLand, Florida, which is near Daytona Beach. And my wife noticed that there was a notice in the newspaper that there was a Buddhist meditation group starting up at a Unitarian Universalist church. And she said, and she wanted to go to it. And I was working as a journalist, and I had a commission meeting to cover the first night, and so I didn't go. So she went, and then she went back the next week, and I had some other conflict that night, so I didn't go. And then the third time, she said, "I wish you'd come with me because they really kind of need some help." So it was started by a couple of people who had read a book or two, attended a retreat or two, and decided to have a meeting and just see who showed up. And so as we left after that first night, I said, "Honey, whatever you do, don't let me end up in charge of this thing." Well, a year later, I was in charge of it. The people who had started it didn't want to continue to do it. One of them had moved away, and one wanted to retire and travel. And so they gave me the keys to the church and said, "If you want this to continue, you have to run it." So at that point, I thought, well, there were people coming to these meetings and really looking for guidance, and I had no credentials of any kind or even any reason to think that I knew enough to offer any guidance. So I got pretty serious and about studying and practicing, and I started going to a Thai temple and met the abbot actually at an event, and so immersed myself in Theravada Buddhism for a few years and ordained. They'll do short-term ordinations. So I basically did a rains retreat as a Theravada monk. And when that was over, I kind of felt the need to play more of a clergy role in my local communities. Besides that group in DeLand, I had started volunteering at the chapel at a correctional institution outside of Daytona Beach. And clergy in chapel settings can have confidential conversations, and if somebody wants to make a formal commitment to the path, they can do that. So I started looking for Buddhist chaplaincy programs, and instead of that, I ended up with Bright Dawn, which is kind of like a Buddhist seminary program, and it was doable. It was mostly done by conference call back then. These days we use Zoom. And so I did that, completed that, and then later on really felt the need to have a more of a monastic approach to Buddhism, and so I ordained in Soto Zen. So that's I have all these different affiliations, and that's why I have multiple Dharma names. Every time you do something in Buddhism, you get a new Dharma name. I started let's see, probably 2012 or 13, something like that. I was invited to an event at a Vietnamese monastery, and the abbot and I really clicked on a spiritual level and also, on a friendship level. And a few years later, he gave me Dharma transmission, which is why one of my Dharma names is in Vietnamese. So Dharma transmission is when a Zen master recognizes you as a successor. And so there's a little ceremony that they do. So that's kind of how that all happened. So these days, I live in Massachusetts. I'm on the worship committee of a Unitarian Universalist church. I've visited a few Buddhist communities around here, but I haven't really connected to one in any formal way. But I still maintain my presence in Florida via Zoom and visits a couple of times a year.
Well, that is a wonderful story, and I'm amazed how you've condensed so many years into that short yet eloquent description. And it's a wonderful path that you're on. As I've already said, making a difference to people and leading by example. So that's wonderful, and the Unitarian Universalist aspect I find very interesting as well because I'd seen a few of your talks on YouTube that were recorded at a Unitarian Universalist church, and that clarifies for me where that came from, and it's a lovely synergy really of different between different back to shortly. One other question for you about your experiences, though, that I feel is relevant because we've touched very much on the outwards journey of the different people that you met. But I'd like to go within. What I mean by that, Sensei Morris, is I'll call you Sensei, I guess. What I mean by that is when you first began to have a change of perception, when you began to have a change of experiences, shall we say, beyond the self, and some of the experiences that come with Buddhism in particularly in the early days. And I ask this question to really make people feel more comfortable with their own practice. Even in my own life, I freely admit that I have worked with a number of teachers, but I'm also largely self-taught. I mean, I'm not sure if that makes me a nightstand Buddhist, like you were saying earlier, because I have done actual meditation in centers, but also largely in areas where I've been, hasn't always been communities either, like you were saying. But for other people, that concept of when they're meditating, maybe they have some misconceptions, maybe they feel like, am I getting anywhere with this? Whereas there's not really anywhere to get to, obviously, other than the present moment. But to share some of your early experiences of changes of mind, changes within yourself, when you began practicing, if that makes sense where I'm going with this one. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that, please? And is my sound okay?
Sure. Yeah, yeah, you're a little wobbly now and then, but it's okay. I'm getting it. So, I mentioned that in the late '80s, I started sitting with a group that was led by a UU minister, and at that time, I had realized that my drinking had been a problem, and so I had stopped drinking, and I was looking for really a path that would help me with that. And so I was doing two things. One, I was sitting with this meditation group that was Thich Nhat Hanh based, but I was also involved with a recovery group that used the teachings of Albert Ellis as the recovery process instead of the 12 steps. And I discovered there was this interesting congruence between what Albert Ellis taught and what the Buddha had taught. And we don't want to spend all of our time on that, but those two things kind of working together really started changing the way I saw the world. And so that was one of the things that really motivated me to practice a lot. I was a real mess, to be honest with you, to having a foundation that I could work from. And while it didn't transform, I was still a mess for a long time, but at least I had a sense of direction of where to go, and I was less of a mess. And so I was able to grow in a personal way. So I've encountered some really amazing teachers in my life who've had a big effect on me. So I'm not going to tell you this to beat up on you. I was a nightstand Buddhist, as I said, for a long time. But when you find someone that you can click with, who can listen to you, who can, help guide you, it's really, really a major gift. And so the abbot of the Thai temple, the psychologists that I worked with on the REBT stuff, Koyo Kabose, who founded Bright Dawn, the Vietnamese abbot that I mentioned, the guy who ordained me in Zen, they were all really instrumental in helping me change my own mind. Having said that, they're all very different. If I sat them down on a panel and we questioned them, they'd all have different answers to different questions, but that's more a matter of how you get to the Dharma than, once We have this saying that, the Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. Well, you only have to go through one Dharma gate and you're there, right? But there's a lot of different ways to get there. And I have an enormous amount of gratitude for those people. Having said that, though, I don't consider myself really a Dharma teacher. One of my role models, was Shenron, who's from back in Japan in the 13th century or so, said, I have no disciples. Meaning, he didn't impart anything. It was just the Buddha's wisdom that people were getting. He was just there as sort of a conduit and a way to it. And I feel very similarly. I try to meet students where they stand and walk with them as they discover their own wisdom. And so, there's a lot of different paths and different teachers. So, I encourage, so while I think it's important to have a teacher, it's also important to recognize that nobody can teach you. You have to find your own wisdom. Did I answer your question, or just talk a whole lot and not say anything?
No, you answered. I think you answered a few. One actually.
Okay, good.
Interestingly, one of the questions I had for you was about people finding the right teachers, for example, and you answered that there. What you were saying, of the answers coming from within. There was another question I had that you answered in there, but anyway, there's a few different things in one. So no, it's a very good answer to the question, and I also appreciate the vulnerability about the difficult times in your life and coming through them as well. That's very valuable to people because, especially with practitioners and teachers at your level, I think there can be a tendency, especially when people are starting out, to look upon people as being perfect. And obviously, I think it's personally valuable to bring that down a little bit and say, okay, we all have the same human experiences, obviously, but how we respond to them is what counts, how we transform them, how we work through them, and so forth. And so the whole lotus in the mud and growing out of the mud concept for me, but however you it, that's very, very important. So you don't really consider yourself a Dharma teacher. Okay, that makes sense. But then, as I said at the beginning, when things like this happen, when people reach out to you and say, hey, I want to share some of your wisdom with the world, I want to learn from you. I know you said just now about you meet students where they're at and everything, but in terms of this kind of thing of being known, of being recognized, obviously it has nothing to do with why you do this. So I appreciate that. But how do you respond to that? Because as I said before, a Buddhist teacher talking about self, even in this context, has an irony to it. It
Yeah.
has, so how do you respond to being a well known and well respected teacher? And from a Buddhist perspective, how do you not get attached to your role as a teacher and then use that to define yourself? I think there's a good lesson in there, maybe. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah. One thing is I put on the robes. Once every once in a while somebody will say, "Oh, you're wearing those robes. That must mean you're special." No, it means I'm not. Right? I'm not. I have nothing. I'm just here to help you find what the Buddha found 2,500 years ago and what has been carried forward to this point. So I'm a member of a community of people who have practiced as best we could, and realized some things that were helpful to us, and hopefully I can help you find that for yourself. So it's not like I'm imparting my wisdom. If I have any wisdom, it's the result of something that somebody did a long, long time ago, 2.5 millennia ago. And thankfully decided to impart that to others who made that same choice. They said, "This has helped me. I want to help other people," and so they carried it forward. And like I said, I never, there was never a time that I said, I want to be a Dharma teacher. There was, there's this need, I'd like to fill it. And to, to the extent that, well, somebody wants to have a Buddhist wedding and I'm the only, if I can be Buddhist clergy and do that, I'll do that. Somebody's dying, somebody's in the hospital, somebody's suffering. How can I help? And so it's, you know, we say these words, vast as the robe of liberation, a formless field of benefaction. I wear the Tathagata's teaching to free all beings. I'm here for others, not for me. I don't, it's not, I wear the fancy Buddhist robe so you'll recognize me as a teacher. That's not why I put it on. I put it on to remind me that I'm part of something that's way beyond me.
That's a very beautiful answer, actually, in all fairness. And I mean, that's very inspiring, the perception and the way you look at that. There is another thing that comes to my mind, though, that I feel is relevant because every question I'm thinking of is this question of service to people. Again, it's like what you're saying there, that mentality that you're sharing of for all beings is every question I'm thinking. And there's another thing here that obviously you mentioned in the very beginning, at a young age, 13, 14, in the Baptist church, and in your views didn't align with certain things of people's rights and civil rights and so forth. But it's interesting that there's an aspect of that from the outside looking in, if you like, that's come full circle now because you are helping people through their suffering. And obviously at that time, you perhaps felt that that church wasn't. So, for example, when you are working with people, as you mentioned earlier, in prisons or people who are dying or that kind of thing. I mean, I'm sure doing weddings and things is lovely, and that's on the nicer end of life. But in terms of the more brutal experiences, I'm curious to go into how you handle that as a teacher, but also how some of those things have changed your perception of people and of life because you would have had experiences of vulnerability with people that a lot of people don't have, if this is making sense where I'm going. And I feel that this will be a valuable lesson in the compassion aspect, in the interconnectedness aspect, and some of these things. But I don't know. I just pick up on the fact that you kind of see behind the curtain with things in people's lives that a lot of people don't. And I'm not expecting you to share anything about anyone because, as you said, it's private. But in terms of some of the wisdom that you've gleaned from that, I feel there's something relevant there. If you don't mind sharing about.
Sure, sure. So you always want, if you're invited into a hospice, for example, to visit with someone who's has a limited amount of time left, or to talk to a parent who's grieving over the loss of a child. I was a university chaplain for several years, and so there was a fair amount of that sort of thing. And you always want to know the thing to say that's going to make everything okay. And there's no thing to say that's going to make everything okay, right? So you just really be present and be available, and and that's 9/10 of it. I realized this. So there's a Catholic church in Florida that does some really beautiful interfaith services, and they invited me to one of their healing services, and it was on International AIDS Day or something like that. And so toward the end, and I didn't know this was coming, but toward the end, the priest said, "So now, all of the ministers will come down on the floor and give blessings to the people who come up and ask for them." And I had no idea, that I was going to do that. And so I went down and I realized that people just wanted to be seen, more than anything. I could have said anything at all, but being there for them was what was really healing. And we have some words to say. I said some stuff in Pali and all of that, but really the presence was the main thing. There was a particular incident, and I can even use this fellow's name because he wouldn't mind. But there was a guy named Michael who was the chaplain at the university where I became a chaplain. And he was a Baptist. So, and by the way, let me back up just a second. There were a lot of really good Baptists working on civil rights and anti-war and that sort of thing. They just weren't at the church that I went to. Okay, so Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist, so I don't want people going, oh, this guy hates Baptists. Anyway, Michael was a Baptist minister, and he was the chaplain at this university in DeLand. And I got a phone call one day from the hospice that said he was in hospice and he wanted to see me. And so I had met him a couple of times. I had given talks at the college and we'd had lunch once. And so I went, what do you want? And he said, well, I'm dying. And they asked me if I wanted to meet with one of their chaplains. And I said, no, because I didn't want to hear all the same cliches that I'd said so many times. He said, I wanted to hear something I hadn't heard before. So he called me. So I knew he had, we didn't know how much time he had. He actually ended up living about a year. But you knew you were talking to someone with a limited amount of time, and you knew that you were talking to someone who was really looking for a way to live in the short period of time they had left. And you don't want to waste any of that saying cliches. And we have our cliches. But I started listening to myself. And anytime I started to say something that was just kind of like one of those things that we say, rather than one of those things that we really experience, I would stop and change. And that was maybe one of the most valuable experiences in my life, was that time that I spent with him. And, he was a good guy. He had probably talked 1,000 people through the end of their life. He'd done numerous memorial services and stuff like that. And so I learned a lot from being with him and sharing the end of his life with him.
Well, I must say that some of the stories are quite moving, not only in your experience, but in the also implications for people's lives in general. And I hope my sound is okay still. Let me know if.
Yeah, you're good.
But that's a very beautiful story again, very meaningful and something that has implications for all of us. I meant to ask earlier, and it actually slipped my mind. But in terms of your own meditation practice and everything, and what you do sort of each day, I suppose over so many years doing this, it's changed and transformed, and naturally you found different ways that work for you. But I suppose if there's a question here, people will be curious because I was talking about looking behind the curtain just now, of doing something similar with yourself, of your daily practices. For example, I know that Buddhism is something that embodies every moment, so I'm not isolating this to saying, you practice at this time. And Thich Nhat Hanh, who you mentioned earlier, I mean, I love the walking meditation and eating and every aspect of life. So I'm not compartmentalizing this. But in terms of the process that you went through to, uh, to sort of free your mind, or as I said earlier, go beyond the sense of self and these sorts of things, up to how many hours you meditate today and what form you do and some of the things like that. Again, I'm asking this for other people because there's a lot of misconceptions. I mean, look, I'm much newer on the path. I've only been sort of into these things the last couple of years. But even then, Thich Nhat Hanh in one of his books said about meditation shouldn't be hard labor. It's something you do, you see what arises. And he gave this really beautiful description. I won't try to put as eloquently as him. And I thought, oh wow, that's really something. And it made the journey so much easier. So I think if we start with your practice, we can then lead into maybe one or two misconceptions that people have and tackle those as well. But starting with you, what does your daily practice look like from when you started to now, please?
Oh, wow.
That's a big question. I'm sorry.
It is a big question. And I'm not going to answer it. No, I'll answer part of it because I think your real question and the people watching's real question is, what do I need to do?
Yeah.
Right. And you don't need to do 9/10 of the stuff that I did because, I did a lot of sort of fumbling around in the dark, trying the first serious meditation I remember doing. I was at an import store and I found a Tibetan strobe candle, which I don't know if these even exist, but it basically was like a wooden dowel with impregnated with some chemical and you burned it and it would flicker. And I sat in the floor of my bedroom on a pillow staring at this candle, listening to listening to this old rock song called Inagata Devita. Now remember I was 13, 14 years old when this happened, over and over and over again. Because what I had seen on the display card was that Tibetan Buddhist monks use these to achieve altered states of consciousness. And I wanted an altered state of consciousness, you know. I don't recommend that as a method of meditation. There's a lot of things that, so let me try to kind of put it into three different areas that one could do. One is you focus on concentration. And there's different ways you can do that. You can meditate on a mantra. One of the first serious meditation books I read is still out there. It's called Passage Meditation now, but it's just called Meditation then. It's by a guy named Eswaran. And I memorized what was considered the prayer of St. Francis and would contemplate that. The act of memorizing something and then reciting it internally really focuses the mental energy sort of in one direction. And that's one of the skills that you develop as a meditator. Mindfulness, you see that word bounced around a lot in a lot of different settings, but it's the seventh factor of the Eightfold Path. And the way I've kind of come to understand it is being aware of what the mind is doing and remembering what it was that you want the mind to do, right? So, mind, you were talking about walking meditation earlier, mindfulness of walking. It's a part of mindfulness of the body. You know what the body is doing. And then the sixth factor of the Eightfold Path is right effort, meaning you notice what the mind is doing and you let go of those things that the mind does that leads to stress. And you develop those things that the mind does that leads to happiness. So you used the word compassion earlier. There's meditations on goodwill and compassion that are very, very liberating. And that's something that I spent a lot of time with back in the early 2000s, was contemplating, may all beings be happy, and then sending that to individual people, may, may my son be happy, may my, best friend be happy, may this guy I just met be happy, may, this political person that I don't particularly like be happy, those kinds of things, until you develop the ability to generate goodwill for anyone. And compassion, recognizing that the suffering I experience and the suffering other people experience are not two different things. It's the same. And so really wanting others to be free from suffering, and that compassion is transformative for yourself, but also you're able to do it because of compassion, because there are others who have learned this and taught it for years and years and years, right? And then, my primary practice these days is a thing called shikantaza, which means just sitting. Don't try it without a teacher. It sounds like nothing. It's the hardest thing in the world. But you're really just paying attention to what the mind does and not attaching to anything that comes up. So yes, my practice has evolved over time, partly because of being, introduced to other teachers and practicing what they suggested, but also you need different things at different stages of your path. Where I was at the very beginning, I was in such a mess, I pretty much needed concentration and just a basic concentration, which also is very hard. I mentioned that as first, but it's the thing that you'll work on trying to refine for the rest of your life. At one point, I was consumed with anger, and so I worked a lot on goodwill and compassion, right? So, and that's one of the reasons why it's good to have some guidance, be a part of a community, be with somebody who can listen to you talk, and then make suggestions about what you could try. And that will change over time.
Absolutely. Very valuable, first of all, in terms of the evolution and that aspect, obviously. But there's quite a few tips contained in there, and the authenticity of the journey is very, very powerful. So I appreciate you sharing that very much. And the way you saw through what I was asking, you said, what do I need to do?
It's not the first time I've been asked. And by the way, I should have mentioned, one of the things I get asked a lot is how much time do I need? How much time do you meditate every day? So say, Boris, which really means how much time should I be meditating? And it really depends on how much time you've got. Consistency, I think, is way more important than volume. So one of my best students, while again I don't claim him as mine or anything like that, but there's a fellow I work with, been working with for a long time, who's a doctor, like a high-ranking doctor at a big deal hospital, who discovered me online, and he was trying to learn how to meditate and couldn't find anybody locally that could fit his schedule, and so we started working together. And he would drive to work. He would leave a little early for work so that whatever time he had before he had to head up to his office, whatever extra number of minutes he had, he would just sit in his car and meditate. And it might be 2 minutes, it might be 10 minutes, it might be 20 minutes, but he used it. The guys at the correctional institution, there are multiple counts during the day where you're not allowed to move around, you're not supposed to talk much, stuff like that. And so that's when they would meditate. If you can meditate daily, even for a few minutes, it's better than if you intend to meditate for an hour in the morning and an hour in the afternoon and don't meditate at all because you don't have time, right? And also, you're going to make progress within the context of your life. If you can set aside time to go to a multi-day retreat where you really can focus on meditation for a period, you'll discover that your mind is capable of things that you didn't know you could do. And so those are important if you can do them. But if not, do what you can and just try to do it consistently, and you'll get benefit from it.
Well, that's really good to hear for a lot of people, including myself, because that's pretty much in that aspect. What I've been doing is it depends on the time of the day. It depends what's going on, but at the same time, a lot of people out there. I mean, I think that making people more comfortable. You'll have a lot more experience with this having taught, but even in my you see people have too high expectations and sometimes too low expect, and you see expectations get in the way of things. And I'm really glad that we have broken that down,
Yeah.
including the individual aspect. Something else I've been really sort of itching to ask you about that I think is really valuable is obviously the whole interfaith aspect. So I'm changing the subject now and put it onto a sort of slightly bigger picture topic, which is the fact that obviously in the world we do see a lot of religious disharmony, unfortunately, but there are also a lot of great people doing great work to bring different faiths together. And it's been very topical for me because I've been in Cyprus. I'm from the UK originally. I'm from Wales, Irish heritage, but I've lived in Cyprus 2 years, and There's obviously, I don't know if you know this, but there's two sides to the island. There was a war, one Christian side, there's one Muslim side, and there's a border, and the borders, guards, and you have to have permits to cross. Although I do cross to both sides, and they're very different, and you get all of this stuff. And there's a long history I won't get into here, and it requires a lot of nuance. But living up close and personal to that gives me a different perspective, even though I'm interested in interfaith dialogue. And I would like to get your thoughts, even though this is a very big topic, on how we can, on a practical day to day level, increase harmony between supposedly different kinds of people with practices. And that is something I would like to touch on as one of the latter subjects in this talk, because I think it has immense value, and it's also something that you have a great deal of personal experience with or interest in. But I am aware it's quite a big topic again, so we might have to narrow it down. But on a day to day level, um, certain steps that people can take, I think it's just feel drawn to this, that it's a very valuable subject, please. Thank you.
Sure. And you're right, it is a big subject. It's one that I've spent a fair amount of time on lately because I don't know how you're aware you are of this, but there's a move in this part of the world basically toward a very sort of extremist form of religion, wanting to dominate the dialogue and all that kind of stuff. So there was some work done by a guy named James W. Fowler back in the 80s, I guess, on the stages of faith. He was a developmental psychologist. And he said, let's research this. Where does faith start? Where does it go? And so, without going into a lot of detail, there's a level of faith that people achieve. It's really, you tend to be dogmatic. I'm born into this religion, or I have discovered this religion, or whatever, and this is the right religion. I know this is the right religion because it's my religion, right? There's about 4 levels of faith beyond that, and there's one that's a level of faith. It's really a level of faith, but it's one that's full of doubt. It's probably the one that I hit when I was 13 years old, right? And then you go through this period of doubt, and then you kind of redefine things, and you find that you're comfortable with uncertainty. In Zen, we call this not knowing. You're okay with not knowing, right? Because when you're able to not know, you're able to discover. Okay. And ultimately, when you reach the highest level of faith, again, according to Fowler, but I find this relatively true, you're able to find that if you're talking to someone who's on a high level of that's made it, they've moved up in that way spiritually, you're talking about the same thing, even if you're using completely different words. So I mentioned the Catholic priest who has the interfaith services. He's one of those guys. And in fact, I would say that all the people that he invited up, on the chancel with him for these things, you could have conversations with them and you're talking about the same truth, even though you're talking about different containers. The truth is the religion is just a container. It's a box you put it in. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that all paths lead up the same mountain, I don't think, or lead to the same mountaintop, but I think they all lead out of the same valley. And the view is pretty good from all of them, So now, how do you do that as an individual? I think it's best to find a path that works for you and to explore it and to recognize that other people have different karma and they're going to have a different path that works for them. Recognize that dogma and faith are not the same thing. In fact, the more dogmatic we are, the less we're open to actual true faith. Knowledge and wisdom are not the same thing. We can know scripture back and forth, but if we haven't embodied it, we don't really know it. We don't have the wisdom. Okay. And so keep working on that yourself and let other people recognize that they've got to find their path. And some of them are only going to make it to that level where they're sure they're right and everybody else is wrong. And that's just where they're at. You're not going to change them probably. But if you embody your own practice, your own faith, then, some people will see that and they'll follow your example. Hope that was
Thanks.
helpful.
Very happy. I was
Yeah.
thinking about the fact that you embody your faith very much, and if I had to put in a nutshell, how I was drawn to you, it's that. And although it's a little bit subjective, what you were saying from my point of view, I mean, not from yours, what you were saying there about the different containers is very much, I very much experienced that, and I very much experienced that by an individual's presence. You can tell before they open their mouth and actually get into, well, I think this, I think that, or I've experienced this. You can really tell um, the level they're on. Now, I haven't actually heard that levels of faith, so I definitely will look into that. But it's very interesting because it matches the observation I've had. So even on a very subjective level, which is what I was saying just now, when you meet people, they have a happiness, a contentment, a peacefulness, joyfulness, some of these things that are very hard to measure, but they have it in large quantities. And you sit with that person to learn from them or anything. And as I've said before they say anything, just from being in their presence, it's the consciousness, you start to feel differently and see things a different way. And I know you will have had that many times. But that containers analogy, I really like that. And the mountains, the valleys, what you really like that. It's very much, very, very valuable change of perception. And yes, I am aware of, yeah, the US, and I won't get into that here, but it's not good dogma. So, okay, the last couple of things, or I say couple, the last two or three subjects I'd like to get your thoughts on. I noticed when I was preparing for this, Sensei, that you also have certification in Japanese psychology practices of some form, and obviously the concept of Buddhism now, specifically as a faith, but I would say a number of faiths, and the overlap with psychology is also becoming more extensively documented. So, following on from what you just said just now about the containers, they lead out of the same valley and so forth, one of the aspects that also I see a great deal more integration is spirituality and psychology, if you like, particularly Buddhism and psychology, but some other things as well that would have seemed once upon a time to have gone more head to head, and now there's a lot more intersection in those. And first of all, your experiences of that and your aspect, because you are effectively also counseling, or that there's elements of your role that kind of overlap with a therapist's role from my point of view, but I also wouldn't pigeonhole you as like a therapist or anything because there's other aspects to what you do. But from where I'm sitting, there's certainly an overlap. So again, it's a very big question. I'm not putting you on the spot to answer every problem in the world here, but just from your experiences of the overlap between Buddhism and psychology and what you do with the Japanese psychology, can we delve into that a little bit, please?
Yeah, sure. So when I was, I'd say probably in the 80s, late 80s, I was reading everything I could get my hands on about Zen and about Buddhism, and I encountered a couple of books on Japanese psychology by David K. Reynolds. And some of the things that he talked about came out of Zen. Some of the things that he talked about came out of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. And so it was interesting. So I read the books and I did one of the practices, is one that came from Jodo Shinshu actually, called Naikan, Naikan, which is a way of self reflection, it's reflecting on your life in the context of your relationships. Usually we think of self-reflection, we think of closing our eyes and, looking at what our mind is doing. It's more looking at ourselves from outside. And so you reflect on three questions. What have I received? What have I given? What troubles have I caused? And the traditional way is you would do this by going through all the relationships in your life, starting with your mother from ages 1 to 7. What did she give me? What did I give her? What troubles did I cause? And I found that, my father was a violent alcoholic, and I had a very troubled relationship with him when I was young, and then had no relationship with him. I just shut him out. And so doing Nikon on my father really kind of changed the way I saw that. He was still not a safe person to be around, but I opened up to him. And but more importantly, I lost some of my crutches. I was blaming a lot of my trouble on my relationship with my father, and suddenly I didn't have that anymore. So now I had to live my own life, right? The other side, the Zen related stuff, Morita therapy, is a lot more about doing. Don't think it too hard. Get your body moving in the right direction. Lead with the body, and your mind will follow. Very much the way we teach, zazen. You get into the position, and then you let your mind sit there, too. So I kind of ended up seeing this personally as kind of the difference. Therapy and spirituality as being sort of like the difference between acute care and wellness program, right? Thinking in terms of spiritual wellness, and how can I be more spiritually resilient? And sometimes you need both of those things. Some people really need therapy before they can do much spirituality. I think over the long term, a good, healthy spiritual practice can support you through times of difficulty, mentally support you through times of difficulty. So that's the way I see it.
Absolutely. That's very, very, very valuable. You know what? I've learned more talking to you in however long than most. I mean, I do quite a few of these talks, but I also, read and study and immerse myself. But I will definitely listen to this back and make notes on a personal level, by the way. And I want to thank you for that at this point, by the way, not to go off topic, but hey, I'm open to it. There's definitely a clarification of my path at the moment that I've been working on, and it's helping, even though my intention is to do this from others. If sometimes I seem slightly stunned after you've said some things because I'm thinking, right, and that really clicks into place. That really makes sense now. I think, okay, and I've had several of those. So sorry if I seem a bit stunned, but that's what it is, and I thank you for
Okay.
that.
You're
This
welcome.
Anyway, as I mentioned, so the last couple of things. Now, obviously, we are talking about practices that are fundamentally focused on the present moment. But in terms of your future plans, which also has a sense of irony, I suppose, from a Buddhist perspective, because I know we can plan for the future, but we live in the now. But even so, I'd like to use this as a lesson to illustrate the journey, not a destination concept, in the sense that you've come all of this way, if that's the correct measuring stick, but you've evolved immensely as a person, which is massively inspiring, by the way. I mean, even what you said earlier about the whole goodwill thing and all of that, and I was thinking, wow, yeah, I've been working on that too, from anger. And there's so many things you said about the evolution. And if we map that forward, because, in terms of your work and in terms of other things that you would like to, um, I don't know if to say achieve, but the impact you'd like to have. So, for example, obviously with students, obviously with people who work with you, with the interfaith side of things. I mean, I'm not sure if what you do with like published works. I mean, if that's something that's ever come to mind, I mean, I must admit that would be very powerful. But these kinds of goals or aspirations for where you go here, if there's certain practices that you're working on now that you feel you're still developing. And again, I mentioned this because you said something earlier about the concentration aspect being something that you work on for the rest of your life. You see, I've been listening very carefully. And that leads me to thinking, well, all of these practices, all of this lifestyle, this embodiment, as we spoke about just now, it is a lifelong process. So now that I've given the context for that question, the question really is where you would like to take things from here in ways that you feel comfortable sharing in this public forum and that you feel are relevant. I think and feel that that would be very valuable to people. Probably our last subject, to be honest, but I do feel is valuable to show the continued evolution.
Okay. So on a personal level, I'm trying to. So there's sort of two things that go on in my head sort of simultaneously, and they're related, but they're not exactly the same thing. And one of them is, how can I impart what I know to others in ways that are meaningful? And and how can I understand kind of in a big picture way, you know, how how to do that. The James W. Fowler Stages of Faith thing, for example, that's been very useful to me more in trying to help others. We actually talked about that when I was a university chaplain. A student comes in the door and says, I want help. Well, kind of where are they? And then what's the next step for them and how do we get them there? And then the other thing is sort of, I'm going to die one day. Where do I want to be when that happens? What is, in terms of my practice? So, we take a vow. Basically, sentient beings are numberless. I vow to free them. That's not one lifetime worth of work. That's beyond this life. But where would I like to be when that moment comes, that this particular body comes to an end? And what would I like my time on this planet to have created, to have caused, right? So, and in order to do that, part of it is just to continue to self-develop. Life is a practice. One of the Vietnamese teacher I mentioned, one of his favorite sayings is, every step of the journey is the journey. And it's true. That my last day on earth is another step on the journey. You're never finished. But at the same time, and this is the conversation that he and I have had, there's no journey, right? You're there already. So a lot of it is just awakening to that and being okay with where you are, living in this particular moment and not focusing on what might happen. And this is something that I'm trying to help people with now as we're navigating tough times, which, by the way, we're always navigating tough times. It's just a matter of what shape they happen to be taking on this particular day. But, recognizing that this is part of the path. It's all part of the path, right? So I'm doing some, I'm posting on Substack. When I'm giving talks, I'm recording them and trying to make them available to people. I've got a podcast out there, but I kind of let it lapse. I ran out of ideas for that one, and I wanted to transcend it. So I'm starting a new podcast. So if people are following me on Substack, they'll find out about that. To really kind of go beyond just the Buddhist teachings, more into those things that we were just talking about, the sort of interfaith stuff and that kind of thing, because I think that that's important in the world right now. I do have a book on sort of basic Buddhist teachings. It's called Wisdom, Compassion, and Serenity don't buy it right now because I'm revising it. Bright Dawn is a big part of my life at the moment. The founder, well, it was founded by Gyome Kabose and Koyo Kabose. Gyome passed away some time ago. Koyo passed away fairly a few years ago, and I'm the president of the leadership council now. And so what I'm focused on there is to keep Bright Dawn, to try to create an organization for Bright Dawn that will continue long after I'm not around anymore. And so and part of that is working on a way to refine the curriculum so that it's really relevant to contemporary times and people all over the world. And at the same time, to define what my Buddhism is. And I say mine, but it's not mine, it's the Buddha's Buddhism. But, how do I teach? What do I have to say that, that I think is worth listening to? And so probably the next book will be that.
Absolutely. Well, all I can say, well, first of all, is a very big thank you, since as I've said already, for the people listening to this. I mean, the good thing about a podcast in this context is somebody could listen to this, the day I put it out there, but they could listen to it 5 years from now when they are at the point of readiness and for a particular topic, or they could listen to it more than once and pick up something different each time, because even in this relatively short time, we've covered that much. But also, what you're saying there as well about preserving your works, if you like, beyond this life and that sort of thing, leaving that legacy, it is of immense value. And all I can tell you is that the world needs this, what you share. And even going back to what you said earlier, I know it's not all you, I know it's from the Buddha's time, but nonetheless, it's of immense value. And I mean, you're talking about passing. I'm going to ask you a personal question here. How old are you now, if you don't mind me asking about that?
I'm 69.
Okay. Well, you look younger, but I mean, that's the meditation
Well,
practice. But
thank you.
yes, experience, I thought, okay,
I feel older, but no, I'm kidding.
but we all,
No.
but okay, but take this one thing, and I know you know this because you're doing the podcast and all this type of stuff. I'm 27, right? So the social media sort of age, if you like, it has pros and cons, and a lot of it is. I was trying to think of a polite term, and I can't think of one. A lot of it's not that great, but it does have obviously the ability to share this kind of wisdom around
Yeah.
the world. I'm going to leave you with something, because I would go so far as to say that we're at this stage with humanity now where the next phase of evolution, if you like, is coming for people. Now that we have, not in any really radical new age, just in the sense that we have this technology. You're in Massachusetts, I'm in Cyprus, we can connect around the world, we can share ideas, people can listen to those ideas, people can connect with each other in ways they never could. Okay, very obvious stuff, right? But obviously, then ideas get shared and synergy and connection happens that never would have happened, which I think in certain quarters at least causes more of an upward spiral of people's awareness, in the sense that a big part of what we've been talking about today is awareness of self, of others, of our thoughts, all these different things. And I feel that as we go into the future, people have the ability to be more aware than they were in older times, even before both of our time. And although this is a massive oversimplification, because I'll let you go in a moment, that aspect of helping people to become self-aware, if you like, at the very least, en masse, is of immense value, because that's what the world needs. And um, obviously, as we become more technologically advanced, people have more time, so therefore they have more time to look around and think, well, what am I doing here and what's going on? How did I get to this point in my life? Because they haven't just got their head down, literally surviving, even though a lot of people have. And so it's all I'm trying to say in a roundabout way, my friend, is that I hope that you continue to spread this wisdom in any ways possible, books, digitally, anything you can do. Today we've played a small part in that, but I really believe what you said earlier, you take the vow, free all sentient beings, is more than one lifetime's worth of work for sure, but in this lifetime, I really hope you continue that. But anyway, that's my view on it for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for everything that you do. And I agree with you. There's important work going on and all over the world. And I think it's wonderful.
Absolutely. And you play a wonderful part of it, as we said earlier, leading by example, embodying the teachings and so forth. But anyway, yes, have a wonderful day ahead. And once again, thank you.
Thank you.
Take care and be well. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe to the Simply Inspired YouTube channel, and there'll be more videos coming soon.